This is the office hours meeting for service APIs for July 8. Welcome to everyone. We have a relatively light crowd today. I know Bowie's going to be joining a bit later on. He's got a conflict for the first half of this meeting. But there's plenty that I think we can discuss. Despite me not getting this agenda up to date, there are a few new issues that have come in that I think are worth some broader discussion, and also a couple pull requests that could potentially use some attention. But before I get going, is there anything that's not on the agenda that someone would like to cover here? Cool. All right. Well, the first one is courtesy of Andrew Cutts. He had an interesting idea about V1 Alpha 0 freeze. Basically, if I had some discussion on Slack with him around this, and it sounds like for their specific use case, they would like to freeze the API in its current state or close to its current state in the next week or two, and they actually want to use it for one of their implementations. And say what you will about that, it raises a very good point that right now anyone wanting to use the API in its current state, which I know is not really supported, but if anyone is playing around with this, they're going to have a really difficult time transitioning from or distinguishing between the CRDs that are constantly changing in our current repository and the eventual release of V1 Alpha 1. Because we're already using V1 Alpha 1 versioning, I think it could confuse our eventual V1 Alpha 1 release. So the idea is they can work with us just changing the version that we're using consistently in the repository to V1 Alpha 0. But I think, and this is, obviously Andrew's not here, but I think their preference was for us to just branch off and freeze V1 Alpha 0 and then continue on with work towards V1 Alpha 1. I responded here. I mentioned some of you on this issue as well, but anyone is welcome to comment here. Any thoughts on the idea of a V1 Alpha 0 or on our API versioning in general?
Is that done ever, like V1 Alpha 0, is that a thing that anyone in the community has done before?
I honestly don't know what the best practice is for API versioning before you actually release an API. I think we need to make it clearer that anything we're doing right now is not actually supported and is actively changing. That could probably use some help, but I think there's probably some value just the way that CRDs work, just having some kind of different version. Maybe V1 Alpha 0 isn't that. Maybe it is pre-release. I don't know. Pre-alpha. I'm not sure what the correct term is, but maybe that would help identify that the version we are currently using for service APIs, the repository, is not actually representative of what V1 Alpha 1 will be. I mean, it will be similar, but this is not V1 Alpha 1 yet. Yeah, I don't know.
So in that case, is it a question of communicating that, no, please not use this one? Or is it more about, we need to, like, we just need to, I think there's just one option that we just communicate that this is not yet even an alpha version. This
Yeah.
hasn't even reached alpha stability yet, so don't use it. And if you use it, create a fork or something like that.
So I'm glad Andrew's joined the call, so he can probably explain the rationale better than I can. So maybe go for it.
Yeah, so it's our fault for starting to use the CRDs before they're ready. But in my defense, at the time, we had a team dedicated to this, and we'd be able to manage any issues. And then that team became the Contour team, and James and Nick can manage any issues. But that team is since no longer on the project either. I'm at a different part of VMware, but I keep falling back into this. So the issue we have right now is we're going to be using some of these CRDs, and we're going to be shipping something ahead of when you plan to lock V1 Alpha 1. And so since those CRDs will be part of a cluster, if someone were to target those CRDs later, the V1 Alpha 1 they're targeting would be pretty different than it's already pretty different than the ones we were targeting. And so we outlined 6 options, and a couple of the options surrounded forking this project and just creating a branch from the commit we were using and calling that V1 Alpha 0. And Rob, when you and I talked the other day, we discussed doing the same thing upstream, but creating it from head. And you said, well, that's probably fairly arbitrary. But you had suggested maybe we just reset master to V1 Alpha 0. And then when V1 Alpha 1 comes out, that's when we rev it to the V1 Alpha 1. This is not a y'all problem, it's an us problem, and we can manage it with a fork, but it would be nice to have a little bit more. It would be nice that V1 Alpha 1 represented, like there would be some transition between a project that has been around for about a year or a little longer, and it's moving model to its finished state. And as it is, there will be no transition, right? It'll just, V1 Alpha 1 will suddenly be V1 Alpha 1. And if we set it to V1 Alpha 0 and then moved it to V1 Alpha 1, it would, again, not your responsibility to solve our problem, but solve our problem in that later this year, when V1 Alpha 1 is tagged, if somebody were to target that, then we can use the more conventional update methods to upgrade the resources that would be at V1 Alpha 0 to V1 Alpha 1, such as conversion webhooks and whatever. But what we can't do, right, is we can't have resources at V1 Alpha 1 from an earlier build of service APIs, and then have people expect those CRDs to be V1 Alpha 1 from a later version of the service APIs. That's something we're going to have to manage internally. And yeah, this is just something that you and I discussed, and you said I should file this. So
yeah, and thanks for the background and filing this. And I'll say selfishly, I like the idea of moving away from using V1 Alpha 1 before we're actually committing resources to V1 Alpha 1, just because I can imagine at some point down the road, other implementations, other users potentially installing CRDs that they think are the V1 Alpha 1 CRDs that actually happen to be older copies of V1 Alpha 1 CRDs for whatever reason. And I think just getting away from that terminology before we're ready to use that could help us out as well, just as a broader term of easier supportability. What version of CRDs are you using? Oh, V1 Alpha 1. Well, which V1 Alpha 1? Yeah.
For what it's worth, I added a link in chat to a commit, Zoom chat, to a commit that I pushed a support branch of one of our fork. And again, the support branch is from an earlier version of service APIs. So it's not going to reflect like PR221, but it did all the work to reset the schema version. And it would need to be, rebased, or it would need to be updated to, on master if y'all were to do this there. But it indicates the work required. It's not too terrible. Yeah, it's not too bad. It's pretty much a find and replace. So, but yeah, this will work for us. Like this will unblock us. And so I don't want to push this upstream if there's resistance to it. Like you said, you indicated that you thought it could be valuable for upstream, and I agree that it does give a nice cutover. And I think I put it in the issue, that something you and I discussed, that we would need explicit messaging saying that there is no guarantee of support at V1 Alpha 0, and we are not planning on offering any conversion webhooks from V1 Alpha 0 to V1 Alpha 1. But at least if you have that cutover, then you could then say, well, you know, now we can start thinking about introducing that once you go from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2.
Yeah, and it's this clear differentiation between pre-release V1 Alpha 0, whatever you want to call it, and an actual V1 Alpha 1 API. And I think something like that Harry had mentioned is, you know, I don't know what, you know, like I don't know if there's any prior art here. I feel like what we're doing is relatively unique. A lot of API design either moves faster or is closely tied to the release of a single product. I know maybe Cluster API, maybe seeing what they've done would be helpful.
This is a problem we created for ourselves, and again, it was
Yeah.
I was willing to accept because there were at times 2 entire teams dedicated to this. But yeah, it's a unique situation because again, these APIs have been out there for a while, and the other option was to, and I think what Contour had planned to do was to fork both the API version and group name. My resistance to forking the API group is, one, I don't want to be responsible for it, and 2, I believe in upstream, and the moment you open that door, it's so much harder to shut when you now are you're iterating on some complete fork, right? This would at least allow people to use these models and provide an upgrade path to whatever comes out eventually. But you're right, I think things tend to be iterated faster. This was a case, and I think I've said this on this call before, right? That if, you know, once I looked at these, if I had to build something from scratch, it would have looked amazingly like this. So I was, you know, maybe wrongfully so, but determined to figure out how to use these and add value here rather than just building something from scratch. So I won't lie and say it's not a unique issue. It is, but I think the Kubernetes API documentation, right? That alpha is alpha for a reason. I think that applies here. You know, we decided to do this, and that's our problem. But if there's a reason to set main to V1 Alpha 0, it solves that problem, and maybe it adds value here as well. But yeah, Cluster API is an interesting one. I've been involved with that since Alpha 1, far more in Alpha 2. I know for a fact that there were companies building on their Alpha 1, and people were really shocked to find that out. But what they did was a little different. They focused on the design first and then added the code later. So by the time, you know, they had the design, they were adding the code. People already knew what the spec was. I don't think they were iterating on the spec and the code at the same time necessarily. So I think this was a little different than that.
Yeah, this feels like a public experiment in API design, where we are iterating, and it could be very easy to confuse what we have here with a V1 Alpha 1 API.
So I think this makes a lot of sense now. What I would suggest we do is we don't name it Alpha 0, because then it closes the door of introducing another version between now and V1 Alpha 1. Just in case, you know, if Andrew's team needs to do that, like, you know, they want to pull in some more features in case, or maybe somebody else who's trying to experiment with it and want to do that, they can't do that. Or somebody between V1 Alpha 1 and V1 Alpha 2 wants another release like this, then that is not a possibility. So if I think Kubernetes
you can have a suffix on the end of the version, just FYI. I mean, you could have like V1 Alpha 0A. You could do that.
Yeah, you could do that, yes. So that, yeah, that would be...
So this is not a unique problem to this version, right? Because we're in this situation where, okay, we said we're going to work on V1 Alpha 1, and then we make a bunch of changes, and then at some point you release that and it's frozen. Now that's going to happen again for V1 Alpha 2, presumably. And
Yeah.
so anybody who, has implementations which depend on intermediate versions of V1 Alpha 2 would be in a similar situation as Andrew is today.
But the difference is, and I'll use Cluster API as an example. They will put together a KEP to say this is what V1 Alpha 2 or V1 Alpha 1 is going to be, right? And the community agrees on the KEP, or a KIPE, because I think it's a CAEP there. And they agree on that, and then people, they create issues off of it, and then people iterate on those issues to drive towards that. But the entire time, it's already understood what that spec is going to be, and in between, let's say V1 Alpha 1 and V1 Alpha 2, they've been really good about not introducing any contract breaking features. Like anything that would violate V1 Alpha, whatever the API contract is, that just gets pushed to the next API version. I mean, there can be improvements and enhancements, but nothing that breaks the contract. And here, there's no contract yet, is I think the issue, right?
Right. So they're doing it in kind of a more, like, you have a group which goes off and kind of experiments with code and comes back and makes an API proposal. And then you kind of have discrete steps which move between API versions. Whereas this service API is sort of doing it more on the
organically.
fly. Or yeah, everyone's sort of working on the same spec as we go. So we're not moving the API in step like they do there. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I've wanted changes in between there, and what you end up doing is you end up filing an issue, and it gets marked for the next API iteration, and then you show up and you make your case for that KEP, and it either gets added or doesn't. Here, but I mean, at some point you have to do the first thing, right? And you have to get a group of people together that has some momentum, and that's what happened here. I think though that there was something between what we have today in service APIs and T0 that would have been good enough for V1 Alpha 0 or even V1. I mean, I would argue probably at V1 Alpha 2. There would have been something, right? This has just been baking for so long that, yeah, I think that was. I didn't even realize that there was going to be so much shift left in. I want to be very clear. I said shift with a FT. Change. So I realized the rest of the sentence didn't qualify what I said. There would be so much shift left between when we pick this up and what would eventually be V1 Alpha 1. And that's my naivete, because Cluster API was really the first time I was so heavily involved in the Kubernetes process. I just kind of thought that's how other processes work. So that was my bad.
Yeah, I'm not sure that, I mean, as far as I know, there's no like complete implementation of the spec so far. Is that true? Does anybody know better?
There are, I'm trying to think. I've seen, I think John Howard with Istio may have had it's not a complete implementation, but there is something somewhere that implements a part of this spec.
We're implementing a good deal of it. Another group in VMware is implementing quite a good deal of it on master. We've kind of, what we're implementing is more L4 focused, but I have a branch internally that has started implementing the L7 aspects of it as well. But yeah.
Good to know, right? Yeah, and we're also working on internal implementation of this that works for some parts of the API as well. So yeah, there is work against the API that has not gone V1 Alpha 1 yet. I know there's obviously, everything we're working towards. I think a great deal of the meeting, if not today, tomorrow, will be about the last few things we need before V1 Alpha 1 release. But that V1 Alpha 1 release is not coming in a time frame, likely at best it's a month out.
Yeah.
And that's not likely soon enough for this specific use case.
And to be clear, our fork locks it currently at the version we're using, so it's not even off of
Yeah.
master. But even if the decision were, well, upstream we're going to set it to v1 alpha 0, it's not going to be locked, but it's going to main would be v1 alpha 0. That's still a better situation than we have today, because we would tell other people who want to target our clusters, even though they're v1 alpha 0, they should be targeting what will be v1 alpha 1. We would be the only, internally, we'd be the only ones using this, v1 alpha 0. And so we wouldn't, even though there would be skew between v1 alpha 0 that we ship and what it looks like right before it becomes v1 alpha 1, no one else would be using that. And it gives us a upgrade path with convergent webhooks and whatever else we need to do. So even if it wasn't locked, it would be better than what there is today, because it wouldn't just be v1a1 to v1a1. And at that point, I'm not even sure what we would do. We'd have to basically, marshal all the resources based on the CRDs out to disk, remove the CRDs, reapply the new ones, rewrite the things we marshaled, and reapply all. It would not be fun. So because of the deliverable timeline we have, like I said, I identified 6 plans. Option 3, which is the lowest risk option, is to fork this, which we've done, at the version we're using, set that to v1a0. That means none of our code has to change, just the schema version we're using. And then we will just handle the upgrade this fall when v1a1 is available. Yeah.
Yeah, this is an interesting one.
It would apply to all of you too. The only unique
Yeah.
thing about us is that we actually will be shipping something with some version of the CRDs, and that's probably not the same for y'all, because y'all were smarter than that. but we will, right? And so, we will. So we'll have to live with whatever we ship. And so I'm trying to reduce later debts, since I'll probably be the one that has to pay off that debt.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, just going back to my primary motivation behind this is just making it clear that what we have now is not v1 alpha 1, that what we are currently working towards is working towards v1 alpha 1, but the CRDs do not represent v1 alpha 1 CRDs or any part of that API yet. And to one of James' points is a good one, that we will deal with this again. We will have a similar issue when we start working towards a v1 alpha 2. And I would argue at that point, we might need to consider a different branching strategy. Maybe we have a v1 alpha 2 branch that all API changes and work towards v1 alpha 2 go into. Maybe we need to rework our documentation so we have some concept of documentation locking at a specific version and then new docs being generated for this new. I'm not sure.
I can tell you
how we do that.
I can tell you what Cluster API does. They do the KEP thing, right? And then they slowly iterate on main to a point where they have to update their APIs. At that point, they update their APIs, they change their schema version on main, but before that, they create a long-lived release branch where they do any backports they need. So if they've got, let's say it's Cluster API version, v1 alpha 3, it would be v031, v032. That's where their patch releases are for those previous versions. But they basically do the cutover on main to the new version once the APIs are ready and the code compiles. And they actually, something that I've never been quite comfortable with, but it works, is main can be broken. They'll leave main in a broken state because they're not iterating towards deciding what the spec is. That's already been decided. They're iterating main to be up to date with the spec that has been decided. In the meantime, they've got those long-lived release branches where they do any backports or any bug fixes to previous releases.
Got it. That's helpful.
So maybe another a kind of a simpler approach for this project could be to have like a pre-tag in the version. So when we're actually working on main on v1 alpha 2, maybe you could call it v1 alpha pre 2, and then when
Yeah.
you're ready to, when we're actually shipping it, then you branch and you version that V1 Alpha Pre 2
It would
as
have to be
V1
V1
Alpha
Alpha.
2.
It would have to be V1 Alpha 2 pre, I think, because of the sorting convention for the Kubernetes resource versions. But yeah,
Okay, is that so? Do you think that kind of scheme could be workable?
I mean, so you know what's really odd about all this? We've had these discussions in Cluster API as well. Vince especially, wants to go back to this is all alpha. It's right there in the schema, except it's also not, right? People are building products on it, and it's being managed like a real product. We got into an issue with GitHub's version numbers because you can't actually do it. When we were doing the releases in the GitHub repo, did you mark these things as pre-release or release, right? That was even a question. But to your specific one, James, like, I don't, it depends. It depends if y'all decide on what the V1 Alpha 2 spec is and you're iterating towards it, or you're iterating on main to discover what that spec is going to be. Like, I think that would change my answer. If you're going to continue to do what you're doing now and you're just iterating on main towards a spec as opposed to sitting down and figuring out what the spec is first, then I think that makes sense. But I would check with other projects as well. I can only speak from experience with Cluster API.
Yeah, because like for service APIs, this kind of, it sounds like in Cluster API, teams go away and they iterate kind of off in other forums, and then they bring it back to the working group. But
Well, no, they iterate like in a Google Doc.
Iterating in,
Yeah, like a
right. So here,
yeah.
Yeah, so here the iteration is in the main branch rather than in a different forum that's then pulled back.
I mean, that's definitely one way to do it. But it may also be worth trying, like getting together and like sitting down and deciding what's needed. And I think it's just more planned, right? And as you have more contributors and you have more stakeholders, knowing where it's going versus figuring it out along the way, I think can be valuable. There's value to both approaches, though.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I agree with that.
While we're talking about this, are there other projects in the community that are using a similar model? This whole concept of a set of APIs for Kubernetes that are basically just CRDs. They're not, this may eventually become core-like, but it's not, at least initially, that way. Are there other good examples of API design this way? Like, I obviously think of Cluster API, but I'm not aware of many others doing this that aren't tied to a very specific product.
Now, and Cluster API is a little unique as well in that they've got a massive like core controller suite. They have a ton of core controllers that they're also working on in that repository. Here, it's more just the APIs. So I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is very helpful. I think I'm interested in additional feedback on this PR, but if I'm understanding the discussion so far, it seems like there's sufficient support for moving away from V1 Alpha 1 to some other versioning for now until we actually hit V1 Alpha 1 as release, and potentially using whatever we do now as a way to test out whatever we might do between V1 Alpha 1 and V1 Alpha 2. But that, we don't have to get everything perfect right now, just as long as we're not confusing the current API with the V1 Alpha 1 API. Does that seem reasonable?
It does, and the one thing you could do once you release V1 Alpha 1 to avoid this without doing anything else, create a long-lived release branch called release V1. I think it'd be like V10 or just like release V1, and then everyone would understand main is not stable. Your stable branch is release V1, and main is where you're doing active development. So at least you will always have at that point a locked or a release that will never deviate from that contract. There may be fixes because you've got some code in there, but there would never be any deviation from the contract that is in that release branch.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah,
a
I
lot
think
of
the only
sense.
concern, sorry, I think the only thing we should just check in with the Istio people if we're going to swizzle around with versions, because I think they had some preliminary support for V1 Alpha 0.
Yeah, that is true. I think it's pretty hidden away, but I'll ask. I think John has been the one implementing that. I'll reach out to him to see if this kind of change in versioning will break things for them.
Ironically, the same reason that I could argue it doesn't matter is the reason I'm asking to do it. It's alpha, so what does it matter what we do? But then at the same time, then we shouldn't be using the CRDs.
Right.
Hey, but I think the bottom line is people are using this regardless of what the technical rules are. And I think it goes back to what I said. It's like, this is really well designed and people want to use it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, appreciate that. And hopefully we can make it even better. Yeah. All right. Well, I think this is good enough for an initial discussion. I know I need to reach out to John for Istio team just to make sure. I don't think this will be an issue for them, and I'll look for some broader feedback as a whole. If anyone is willing or has time, if they want to capture a part of this discussion, or yeah, open a PR even. But even just capturing part of this discussion either in the agenda or in this issue would be awesome. But okay.
Once the recording is up, I can go back and
okay,
kind of take some broad notes. I'll probably just do it in the issue if that's okay with everybody. Or if people don't, I mean, I think there were, James, you were one, and I'm sorry I forgot the other person that spoke, but if they wanted to just add their feelings in the comments as well, but I'll do it by the end of the week. So
okay, sounds great. Thanks. All right, well, there were a couple other issues that I thought were worth mentioning, and one I thought was especially interesting was raised by Mark, and this is I actually chatted with him a bit offline because I wanted to understand this a little bit better so I could at least explain how I understood it. But he is proposing some additional versioning that, as I understand it, and Mark I don't think is on this call, so he can't correct me, but hopefully my understanding is reasonably good here. There was some level of desire to add some kind of versioning to the way an implementation interprets an API. So there may be different versioning of a release, but there may also be within that release slightly different ways to interpret the same field. I'm hoping these are relatively rare, but I could see a variety of potential cases where our spec cannot be quite specific enough and an implementation may want to have this additional level of versioning. So to anyone who's currently working on an implementation or thinking about implementations, is this additional level of versioning, so this is separate from the release of your controller, this is separate than the release of the API, this is really just the version of interpretation or the type of interpretation of that API. Does that feel valuable to anyone here?
To me, it seems like an implementation specific issue, or a vendor specific issue. Like the easy answer is you would have multiple controllers that would key on some field. You'd have one controller that would decide what to do based on some field. But I mean, this is either a issue broader than this project and applies to many other projects, or it's a vendor specific detail. And that's what annotations are for.
Yeah. Yeah, and we do have gateway class parameters, which, I think is likely the place for this, but I think this issue was brought up because there was some idea that this might apply to more vendors, that more potential implementations would have this same kind of versioning consideration, and it might be something like that instead of being implementation specific was useful to other use cases. But it sounds like there's not a whole lot of interest
Well, is
out
this,
there.
sorry, Rob, is this specific to Gate? Did Mark indicate whether this was specific to Gateway class or not? Because that can change things. Because if I think about from a vendor perspective, let's say it's HA Proxy or Avi, they're going to have all these other resources. They're going to have gateway resources, they're route resources that may also be subject to this,
Yeah.
how they interpret these fields. That's why I mentioned annotation. You mentioned
Yeah.
parameters, which leads me to believe that it's specific to the gateway class. Well, if it's parameters, then they should just point that to different versions of a resource. Like they could have config version 1, config version 2, config. You see what I'm saying? Else, it seems like it would apply to all of the resources associated with their implementation, not just gateway class.
Yeah.
But I don't know because Mark isn't here.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, a lot of the different examples we talked through were related to new features being added or new functionality being added or slightly different interpretations of specific fields. And in all cases, it felt like something like that maybe could be handled by, like you say, an annotation, or if it's a higher level thing, a parameter in gateway class, or a new version of the controller implementation, a new release.
Wait a minute, is this the same issue as the one I just had? Actually, I'm reading this again. This is not, one schema version changing over time.
No, this is the implementation now supports feature X, or the implementation now has a different way of handling this type of route, optionally. Maybe, and as an example, we don't actually have this, but this is a rough example. Maybe the first version of the implementation used regex, a specific form of regex, and the next version of the implementation added support for a different form of regex. And there was some way to say, oh, by the way, I'd rather use this kind of regex for everything. But that feels like an implementation specific parameter at that point. So
yeah.
Okay.
I would think of like multiple versions of Word that operate on the spec for a document version, but they're backwards compatible or forwards compatible based on the features of the newer versions of the word processor. It feels like that's what this is. Yeah,
agreed.
So at best, I would say like there could be something specific to like extensions or something, but this, like I said, feels broader than just, this seems like something that would impact anything that use CRDs.
Yeah. I'll have to check back in with him and make sure I'm understanding this properly, but I think I agree with that conclusion as well. Those are the two issues that came in the past week. The other ones we've already discussed in some form. They're about new protocols and a variety of other things. There is one issue. Maybe it already got merged. Never mind. Okay, so there was one issue created that all our examples were out of date. This ended up being a bigger PR than I thought, and I will give credit where credit is due. This would not have come up if James PR had been in. So I am excited for James verifier to make it in, and I think Bowie's gonna give a look at this today. I hope.
Yeah, it helped me when I tried to do some examples, but there's still validation. But there's still validation which can bite you.
Oh, right.
This will check the syntax. This will check like high-level syntax, but it doesn't actually run all
Yeah,
the
that's a
API
good
server
point.
validation, which we have quite a lot of.
Yeah, the required fields and a variety of other things. That's a great point. And one of the things I ran into with our examples as they exist, and is that we have one example right now that specifies a namespace, a non-standard namespace, and it makes sense. Like that namespace makes sense in the context of the example. I think it's SSH server or something like that. But that doesn't just exist. So just running a kubectl apply examples is going to fail if you don't have that that namespace around.
We should just stuff it in.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree that
So
it's good to make those examples self-contained things that you could run, that you could apply. I think that's
yeah,
that's a good policy.
yeah. So overall, I think we're making progress here. This kind route binding selector I think was also generally positive, and all the feedback has been responded to last I checked, and approved, and just needs maybe one more LGTM or approval at this point. But this should help in a vast number of things. And I think those are the big changes that have happened in the past week. I should also mention, for anyone that didn't notice, this is way down here because it's an old PR, but John created a PR to AutoGen client lister and informers for everything. It was a relatively large change, but fortunately did not add any new dependencies. It just added more code gen, unfortunately. But this should help implementations either be easier to use or certainly more scalable if we're dealing with thousands. If we imagine an implementation dealing with, say, thousands of resources, these generated clients can be more efficient than dynamic client.
I did add a note later that the change to the name of the directory is sort of orthogonal to the direction of other projects. I know this isn't necessarily based on KubeBuilder. I had one note that was wrong because I thought he had added some dependencies because that client set generator often does, but in this case it didn't. But the API directory rename is going to seem odd to other people working on things that are based on KubeBuilder.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, because
And
APIs itself is something that is common as a directory in other Kubernetes code bases.
It is.
Right?
It was actually a change that happened in the last, I want to say, 18 months for KubeBuilder. It was a
Okay.
KubeBuilder 2, and all the newer projects, and even like Cluster APIs made the change, and a lot of existing projects make the change to. It's kind of like how everyone used the package directory, and some reason KubeBuilder decided to do away with it, and so you're seeing these projects put everything in the root directory now. Same deal. And the issue is around a lot of the generator code, which still expects the older layout, which is what he hit.
Yeah.
And part of that is because I think they're trying to deprecate some of that because people are tending to move away from I even asked this question as well, the generated client sets towards controller runtimes client. And there are going to be cases where the generated client is more efficient, as you said, but I don't know who owns that code and if they're going to update it to account for the other changes that, I would say that any new projects are probably going to be based upon if they're using Go and KubeBuilder.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I know the concern had been around the larger potential scale. Like if someone has, say, thousands of routes in their cluster or something like that, you might start to notice the difference in performance between dynamic client and everything that it has to do versus the generated clients. But that's a good point about the rename and now non-standard project structure, where we're not quite a KubeBuilder project structure anymore, but we're also not the standard, upstream K/K, whatever, with everything in package that everyone's moved away from. Yeah. Okay.
It's just
That's a
maybe
good note.
maybe something that comes up. Somebody might have a question, and maybe it'll be now be in the back of people's heads, like, oh yeah, we know this is an issue, but we had to do it
Yeah,
because.
yeah, yeah. That makes sense.
And quite frankly, if you ever do go to the design the spec up front, then you could potentially, you know, make this change to generate the clients, then change the folder back. And you would have to do that whenever you want to generate the clients. But ideally, you know, you only ever do that when the API changes.
Yeah,
But again, that would not be something you can do right now as you iterate. But and this may not even be an issue for you, but the API thing is going to be weird to people.
yeah. Yeah, that the whole idea of generating a spec up front is interesting, and it's certainly something that I think this project kind of started with and tried for a bit, in the sense that we had this doc and there were just tons of comments on it, back and forth about every little component, and at some point I think it got too complicated for us, and it was deemed that this was maybe easier or more straightforward. I don't know if that was a good or bad decision, but it is nice to have the Git history associated with this, where a Google Doc, as we were using before, if something changes, it's harder to see the history or rationale behind. Not that it's particularly easy with Git commits, but it's at least somewhat more straightforward to go back to different versions and see who changed and why. But it's a good question, and certainly maybe once we start to have a solid base, a V1 Alpha 1, maybe we can revisit that approach, as I imagine future alphas will be more iterative instead of just we have to think everything from the ground up with this V1 Alpha 1. Yeah. On the version value, that, like, if we're moving away from V1 Alpha 1 for the time being until we actually get to a V1 Alpha 1 release, was the preference to call it V1 Alpha 0 or V1 Alpha 1 pre?
Again, the pre is the V1 Alpha 0 is more straightforward, but
Okay.
I have to double check the sorting rules. I sent a link. Did it answer the question? Because none of the values in the link I sent include anything after the scalar.
Yeah.
They just show this, but I know you can from experience. It looks like one way to do it would be to not have the V prefix, because it's always going to get sorted at the bottom. So if that makes sense, you could follow the same convention otherwise. And you could be like V1 Alpha 1, but instead of V, it could be like P1 Alpha 1. I don't know, but I would assume to see an R there for release at some point, because the way people used to do that. I think it's something you could play with to find out. But I agree with James. It would be silly to do V1 Alpha 0 and then not follow that convention in the future.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, I think that's everything we had to discuss today. Before we call it a day, is there anything that I've missed or anything that someone wants to discuss? Cool. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for the great feedback here. And I will follow up. I guess I'll follow up on that issue specifically. I'll reach out to John and also check in with Bowie as far as his thoughts here. And if anyone else wants to comment, that would be great for a bit more context. All right. Well, thanks, everyone.